Hi, folks. Jonathan Lee here, CEO and founder of Perfect SME, the company that created and owns this remarkable new tool called ImplementERP.ai. Today, we're going to go over some basic facts regarding ERP. In this session, we'll cover the ERP lifecycle, the various phases within that life cycle, and then we'll close it out with a couple of interesting facts and tips. A little bit about us, very quickly. Our company is dedicated to leveraging methodologies created for Fortune 500 and Global 1000 firms, but in a practical and simplified manner so that smaller enterprise can also benefit from them. Second, once you see and understand the definition of an ERP lifecycle, you'll see why our tool ImplementSME.ai is so important and so powerful. It's so ideal for using in any type of ERP project. And it's even more potent if you leverage our tool for all phases of a single ERP lifecycle. So more about that in a bit. All right, so let's go over the definitions of the phases in that life cycle. First of all, you have to have a starting point. For most companies, it starts here. Obviously, we're going in a clockwise direction, but the requirements gathering is where a company decides what it is it needs from a system. From there, you move on into selecting, so procuring and negotiating all that, not just the ERP system itself, but don't forget, you'll be negotiating and arranging for consulting services. Okay? That's a very big part of system selection that's sometimes forgotten when a product is picked, and then later on, the company's in for some surprises as they now have to contract the consulting force to help implement it. Next, you have the biggest and longest and very, very often the most laborious phase, which is the implementation. We'll talk about timelines, facts and facets there. And then afterwards, and this is the part where I mentioned there really is no end of an ERP lifecycle, because after you've gone live, you'll have to focus on improvements. You'll have to go back and recall the functionality and the features that you decided for whatever reason you couldn't or wouldn't do as part of the standard implementation. So obviously those come after the fact in a series of post go live optimization waves. So more detail on each of these. First, the requirements gathering. All right. This could be a brand new company and it thinks it knows what the needs are going to be for the next few years. And so it sets those list of requirements and moves forward with that, okay, as the basic list to move forward with for system selection. A lot of other times, though, there are companies that are, let's say, 10 or 40, even 100 years old, and they've gone through all this before. But the company has changed. The complexity has increased. The geographies, particularly different countries, have expanded. So for whatever reason, the requirements gathering really is a follow-up of the steps that went prior. And they want to see if the current system is going to make it or they're going to need a new one. And if they do need a new one, then those requirements is the basis, it's the crux of the system selection phase. So let's talk about the selection phase, which, well, first of all, if you're going to do a selection, you better have done something like a requirements gathering, or it's just going to be a series of long, drawn-out conversations with a wide variety of companies with nothing concrete to move forward with. But assuming you've done the requirements gathering and you're deep in the system selection, what ends up happening is you take that list of requirements, you put it in a RFQ, an RFI, RFP, send it out to a number of vendors. They respond back, usually results in a series of demos with a handful of those original companies you reached out to. And then usually companies select two so that there's a bargaining position. And then you bargain on the software, you negotiate on the consulting, and then from there, you go into the implementation. All right, on the implementation, now, here's where it gets real interesting. It could be 4 or 5 months. It could be 4 or 5 years. It just depends on your company, your complexities and needs. But also, are you only replacing a system that handles the financials? Are you only replacing a system that manages HR or production or some odd combination of the above? Okay. If it's everything under the sun and you're a larger company, that's where the 4 to 5 years comes into play. If you're a smaller company and you're only doing financials or you're only doing production, let's say you're doing something like a warehouse management system, WMS, those could be relatively short and straightforward. And in whatever case your implementation may have followed, afterwards, you will have a series of bugs. You'll have features and functionality that you didn't tap into that are built into the system. You just, for whatever reason, couldn't build it out in the implementation, or there's some realizations you make after go live. So any and all of those examples or scenarios make clear the need to continuously improve upon the system, the design, the build out, and that's what happens in this phase. Now, while all of these may look somewhat equal from a timeline perspective, they're really not. This one is by far the longest. It's usually a couple of years all the way to past 10 years because some companies don't like change and don't want to go through a new selection and implementation, in which case they may just continue to just build out as much as possible from whatever they have at that moment. All right, facts and facets, okay? Or as my kids say, fun facts. So let's talk about the timeline. There's a huge range. The overall ERP lifecycle can be a few years to 20. For companies between 200 and let's say 1,000 or 1,500 people, you're looking at about a 5 to 9 year cycle. And how is that? Well, a system selection with the business requirements and all that, 6 months to 12 months, okay? Perhaps 12 months from a calendar timeline, but 6 months of actual activity. Then you have the implementation, which could be, like I said, 4 months if it's very, very narrow and for a simple company. Most often, I'd schedule 2 years for companies that are doing a project. I've selected an ERP system that includes, let's say, customer service, finance and accounting, admin, maybe some basic HR, definitely payroll, and then, of course, the production and fulfillment steps. That is a typical, I would say, list of modules, and that would be, if I had to say an average or a median, would be about 2 years. Okay. So, what are the factors that cause those timelines to change or be higher or lower? Well, if you purchase a company, if you were purchased, those might accelerate timelines. If there's an economic cycle that's not favorable, that might extend timelines. So the time, for example, between activities. And then this is one that's unfortunate, but there's a lot of situations out there where poor leadership, and let's say ownership or stakeholders that say, hey, just make do with what we have, even though they might be leaving 3 or 8 or more points from their revenue that could flow to net income, and they just choose to continue to use that to manage manual, inefficient processes. So those are some primary factors. The amount of effort, you might have guessed from the description of the ERP lifecycle phases that from a total time, labor, effort, and cost, the requirements gathering and system selection process is quite low, very important, but from an effort perspective, lower. The implementation phases are usually quite high. And then the optimization phase, I'll call it medium because even though it's not intensive usually, there's so many that occur over that 2 or 5 year or more timeline. Okay. The amount of effort that is required really comes back to the simple question: is that opportunity for ERP improvement or ERP impact small, or is your leadership poor? In which case, the effort is lower. Is the opportunity huge? So an enterprise transformation situation, or the leadership is really good, understands and knows how powerful an ERP system can be for their organization. And in either of those cases, I would adjust the level upward. Okay. For resources, you have your full-time employees, but you also have temps and external project managers. I've done a lot of this work myself, still do. And this is where you do not select a project management person from your primary consulting firm. You hire someone that's an advocate for you, and then they work with the outside consultants. Okay. So that's usually a good combination of resources. And quick fun note, do listen out for the cheapness comment that's coming soon. Now, what causes issues? First of all, having no approach, so no methodology, having too many or very poor PM tools, and reliance on cliches. So people who just say to each other those phrases like executive sponsorship, or garbage in, garbage out, with no actual concrete method, framework, or tool that actually does something with those cliches. And then the organizations that tend to try to save a nickel, they end up using or spending $5 down the road because it was just not the right decision to short-sightedly try to save a couple bucks on such an important endeavor. And I'll just talk about the best practices real quick. I had a client with a internal person by the name of Melissa. I won't mention the company name, but she was a master at maintaining a terrific cadence. And that was an incredibly successful project, 30% under, more than 30% under budget, 30% or more faster on the timeline. Just a remarkable example of how an ERP project can be. And that was because the method that she used for communication was to make sure that we're powering forward. She was very polite, but very direct, very concrete in her messaging. And she knew when to engage leadership and when to push herself. So that cadence plus the culture and personality, those are really some great contributors to a successful ERP project. Now let's talk about some ways that you can maximize your approach and maximize your success. And our tool is, we think, the best there is in the world. First of all, because it forces you to identify and map the processes that are affected by your ERP project. Again, whether it's requirements, selection, implementation, or post-go live optimization, always using that same framework over and over and over again to make sure your processes are covered. We also use an ERP specific PM approach. And in our tool, it's called the Status Center. It allows you to know what processes you're looking at, what forms you're evaluating, who the owners are. You can filter by status. You can filter by phase. There's just a lot here that allows the PM to track the ERP project and know when to go chase people down, as opposed to when he or she, by him or herself, can go and see how the project is going and not waste time by having 12 people on a status conference call. Okay. Here's a methodology and a built-in feature in our tool that allows you to make sure that all of the screens that you're working on are properly built out, properly designed, properly tested, and then trained to everyone who's going to be using that form down the road. So again, we don't use any spreadsheets or generic PM tools because they don't have the context or the structure like our tool does. And then As a natural byproduct, when you do that, you have a dashboard that is second to none, including a view of process readiness. So instead of saying 69% of your tasks are complete, this says some percent of your record to report is complete. Some percent of your quote to cash readiness is in place. So a remarkable and very different way of taking a look at your ERP projects and gauging using the right measures. Well, everyone, thanks for your time and attention. If you have any questions, you want to chat about anything you've seen in this recording, info@ImplementERP.ai, and check us out. You can learn more about our tool and what methodologies are built in by visiting us at ImplementERP.ai. Bye, everyone.